Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the great things about being at the McGill Summer School is that it enables those of us who are engaged in political debate in Leinster House to get out of the bear pit that is Dáil Éireann and to come here to Glentees and in a more relaxed and probably more reflective mood talk more sanguinely about the problems of our country. Seeing such a big crowd here tonight, feeling the surge of heat rising already at this early stage of our proceedings, the thoughts of frying pans and fires come to mind. But it is a great opportunity, and the McGill Summer School is a great opportunity to stand back from the day-to-day political contest and to debate the bigger issues and to take the longer-term view of where we are as a country and as a people. And that kind of perspective is not a summertime luxury. It is a vital necessity. And now, more than ever, we need a sense of direction, a sense of what we are trying to achieve and of what we are about. It would be easy to be downcast or to be even despairing at the scale of our problems. The economy is in deep trouble, and there are multiple crises to be addressed. We are in trouble, but we've been in trouble before. We have had crises before, and we have dealt with them. More than that, we have shown before that as a people, we can emerge from a crisis and build something new and better. We are, if we choose to be, at a major turning point in the history of our country. Over the coming years, we will be celebrating a number of centenaries that mark the beginning of an independent Ireland. The 1913 lockout, the 1916 rising, the first Dáil. These were all events that took place as Ireland struggled to gain political independence. National freedom. In the 40 years that followed, the first phase of the history of our state was devoted to consolidating that independence, asserting our sovereignty through neutrality, building the infrastructure of the state, developing projects such as the Shannon scheme. It was a vital phase in our history with many accomplishments, but it ended in crisis, a profound economic crisis and one which tested our people to the limit. T.K. Whitaker has described that moment in history in the following terms. The years 1955 to 56, he wrote, had plumbed the depths of hopelessness. One of the recurring series of balance of payments crises was overcome, but only at the cost of stagnation, high unemployment and emigration. The mood of despondency was palpable. Something had to be done, or the achievement of national independence would prove to have been a futility. And yet, from that moment of despair was built a national revival. It began with the document Economic Development and the first economic programme which started to open up the economy. But opening up the economy was only a prelude to broader change, to the opening up of society. Over the decades that followed, Ireland changed, or rather was changed, radically. Free education, membership of the European Union, the expansion of third level, the liberal agenda. The achievement of political freedom was followed by the achievement of personal freedoms and social progress. It didn't happen on its own. It happened because people made it happen. People who were mortally sick of watching their brothers and uncles carry cardboard suitcases onto the boat to England to work on labouring jobs and to live in doss houses. People who had had enough of an overbearing church and an overbearing society and were prepared to demand change. People who saw that there was no contradiction between being fully Irish and being fully engaged with the wider world, for whom membership of the European Union was a conscious exercise of national sovereignty and a practical way to pursue our interests on the world stage. Now again, we are at a moment of crisis. Now again, we must launch a new stage in our history. Call it what you will. A new stage, a third act, a paradigm shift, a fair society, or an expression that I find increasingly appealing, a new republic. We have an economic crisis but it is part of a political and social crisis too. The model that drove us since the late 1950s has been under pressure for some years. We built a strong, open, exporting economy, but it was hijacked by property developers and by speculators. It did not suddenly happen with the collapse of the Lehman banks. It had been happening for a number of years before that. We embraced the European Union, but we have not fully succeeded in conveying the merits of that membership. We opened up society and gave people greater freedom, but we have seen a coarsening of society in the wave of crime and death driven by drug crime. Too often, our people have been treated as economic units, not as members of a society, subjected to poor planning, high house prices, inadequate services, and now left with the bill. Our economic model was simply not environmentally or socially sustainable. Of our present housing stock, approximately 1/3 was added in the past 10 years, yet the environmental standards to which they were built were shamefully inadequate. Despite the rising tide of the past decade and a half, Ireland has remained one of the most unequal societies in the developed world. In the prosperous times, social welfare rates increased, yes, but the opportunity to reform the social welfare system, to make a trampoline out of a safety net, was passed up. We did not grapple with our social problems with any degree of determination or vigour. We suffered too from a want of confidence and ambition. In 2006, at the height of the boom, it was deemed acceptable for government to set a target that illiteracy would be lowered to 15% by 2016. 15%. In other words, we considered at our best economic times that it was okay that 1 in 6 children, mostly in disadvantaged areas, would have reading problems. The great opportunities to reform public services were missed. In 2001, Labour proposed universal health insurance as the means to develop a better and fairer health service. Since then, health spending has increased by €10 billion. The policy of building super private clinics has utterly failed, and we are left with the bureaucratic monster that is now the HSE. So the task that confronts us now is a great one, but the scale of our ambition must be great also. To avoid another lost decade by making the right decisions on the economy, but at the same time, to launch a new phase in our history, to build a new republic. A republic marked by both responsibility and expectation, where the opportunities available to our citizens are matched by their sense of responsibility to the state and to each other, where government is exercised, not on behalf of a privileged few, but on behalf of the many, where personal freedom is buttressed by social solidarity. The foundations of that new republic are, I believe, threefold. A return to full employment, a health service that is both excellent and equitable, and an outstanding system of education. Get those three right, and the rest will fall into place. We must finish the educational revolution, and we must establish and vindicate as an indisputable element of citizenship the right to read. The new republic must be based on building a sustainable and enduring progress, a progress that reaches into all classes and regions of Irish society, that meets our global obligations on aid and carbon reduction, that marks Ireland out not as the Klondike of Europe, but as the clean man of Europe. That progress will not just be measured in material terms. The yardstick by which we measure the quality of our children's lives cannot be the design or brand on the back of their jeans. We will measure our legacy to them in the quality of their lives, the texture of their civilization, the sense of duty to each other, and their contribution to the world. And to achieve this, we will need to pursue an agenda of reform led by reform of government itself. We cannot pretend that the difficulties we face are solely the result of the global financial turmoil or of the irresponsible actions of a few. We are where we are because there have been profound failures of governance. This is the second time in a generation that Ireland has been brought to the brink of bankruptcy. Now again, after 12 years, when an export boom was allowed to be turned into a property bubble and the exchequer was once again turned into an electoral war chest, we have an even worse crisis. We must ask searching questions about how that was allowed to happen and about how the banking system was allowed to become so overextended and compromised, and we must end government by click. But of course, we must begin by confronting the immediate economic crisis. The crisis itself has three dimensions: the banking sector, the public deficit, and the crisis in the real economy, the loss of jobs and businesses. These three dimensions are interlinked. Each affects the other, and each must be dealt with in parallel. My chief criticism of the government has been its almost exclusive concentration on the banks and the public finances, and the relatively limited attention that has been given to the real economy. That is a mistake. Every worker who loses his or her job costs the Exchequer at least €20,000 in taxes foregone and social welfare benefits paid out. Every person who loses their job is potentially another mortgage in arrears and another strain on the banking system. The IMF were clear on this. They said the risks arise from continuing interaction of slowing growth, financial sector stress, and the state of the public finances, with each threatening to pull down the other. So we must have a strategy to deal with the crisis in the real economy as well as the problems in the banking sector. I want to see more done to support enterprise. I want to see a meaningful scheme emerging from social partnership talks that will help to protect existing jobs, that we would invest to save jobs rather than bear the cost of unemployment. I want to see support being provided where employers create new jobs. Labour has proposed a time-limited PRSI exemption where a firm creates a new job that is filled by someone on the live register. And I have been arguing for some time for a new approach to public investment. With the fall in economic output, we must reassess our infrastructural requirements. Yet, we also know that there are very many infrastructural projects that could be carried out, which would yield a positive long-term return to our economy. There are hundreds of schools with poor quality buildings. There are urban regeneration projects that are ready to go but unfunded. There are areas where water is not drinkable and towns awaiting flood relief schemes. We need a new assessment of the size of the capital spending envelope over the coming years and how it should be allocated, and we should be prepared to front-load that allocation. There is an opportunity to make those investments now when there is spare capacity in the building sector and tender prices are at a historic low. Investments with a social but also an economic return that will support economic recovery. To drive this process, Labour has been calling for a new national development plan to be drawn up. We believe that there is potential for if it is to be funded through a national recovery bond, could potentially allow the government to raise funds on more favourable terms than are available through the money markets. And we have proposed a state investment bank that would play a key role in financing investment by the state, semi-state and private sectors. And for more than a year now, Labour has been arguing for a determined effort to be made in providing new opportunities for people who have lost their jobs. It is simply not economically, socially or morally sustainable for the state to sit back and ignore 500,000 people on the live register. There are a variety of needs, and there must be a variety of responses. We know, for example, that construction employment will not return to former levels, so there are construction workers who need new skills and training to find work in other sectors. The UK economist David Blanchflower has pointed out too that a period of unemployment at the start of a young person's career can have a lifelong effect on their career and earnings, so we need work experience programmes for them. We must learn the lessons of the 1980s and do everything possible to avoid the build-up of a new problem of long-term unemployment. We must invest in the pool of skills and talent that will drive recovery. Having 500,000 people on the live register is a social emergency, and we should respond to it as such. We need a determined drive to put every resource at the state's disposal to use, and in my view we should have a target of at least 100,000 additional training, work experience and education places. As I travel up and down the country, meeting business people, many of them running small concerns, the number one issue that comes up is credit. The bank won't listen, the bank won't lend. There can be no doubt that dealing with the banking crisis is absolutely essential. Where I differ from the government is on the best means of doing it. I oppose the blanket guarantee because it was too far-reaching, because it handed over too much power to the banks. Now we see the natural consequence of that decision in NAMA. I do not say that NAMA won't work, eventually, but it will only work after the state has taken on an unacceptably high burden of risk. The approach that Labour has favoured, of temporary nationalisation of the large banks, allows the bad loans to be dealt with, but at a lower risk to the state. The three dimensions of the economic crisis must be addressed simultaneously, but also must be addressed fairly. That is not an optional extra, it is a necessity. Because if it is not fair, it will not be credible, and credibility is central to success. For an economic strategy to work, people inside and outside the country must believe that it can work. Without that credibility, we will not restore the confidence that our economy needs to function and that has deserted Ireland both domestically and internationally. That means that the burden of adjustment cannot be inflicted on any one group at the expense of others, and certainly not on those least able to bear it. This will be seen most obviously in how the fiscal crisis is addressed. There is a new mantra coming now that we must base the adjustment on cuts in expenditure rather than taxation. Frankly, that is incredible. The size of the problem is too great for that. I keep hearing that you can't tax your way out of a recession, but you can't cut your way out of it either. If government embarks on a process of slash and burn in public services, then it will lack credibility because it won't be sustainable. Nor can you credibly argue that the tax code should remain unreformed and that those on high incomes continue to avoid paying a fair share of tax while taking the knife to social welfare and to primary education. This is where the crisis must be turned into opportunity. The cuts that are required in public services will be painful, but they can and must result in a leaner and more efficient public services. Labour has been seeking for some time the establishment of a commission on taxation, and that is now soon to report. From that, we must work to develop a tax code that promotes investment, puts a proper price on carbon and is manifestly fair. The report of the McCarthy Group is a serious document and needs to be considered in a serious way. For a progressive party like Labour, achieving value for money in public spending is vital, precisely because we believe in public services. Even if I disagree with some of the findings in the report, the fact that the McCarthy Group could identify so much waste and duplication is quite a statement about the attitude to public expenditure over the past 12 years. We know that there is a need for public sector reform, but what we need is surgery, not butchery. If we try to roll back the clock by 5 or 6 years to undo the recent expenditure growth, then we will fail. What we need is to look forward 5 or 6 years and through fundamental reform build a leaner, more effective public service. There is a huge agenda here that I believe requires the focus of a senior minister for public sector reform. Brian Lenihan, I know, has a lot of things on his plate. He's Minister for Finance, Minister for the Budget. He's now the Minister for Banking, and he's also the Minister for the public sector. We've been talking in this country ad nauseum for years about public sector reform and the need for public sector reform. If we're serious about public sector reform, then it has to be driven by somebody and by some agency. I know that one of the recommendations in the McCarthy report is the proposed abolition of the Department of Gaeltacht and Rural Affairs. I think there is space for that, and I think that the abolition of that department would give rise to a space for the creation of a new Department of Public Sector Reform. And that minister and that department should be given a clear mandate and should make it their task to abolish themselves as quickly as possible when their work is done. The cuts agenda must not stand in the way of more fundamental reform. We will not rebuild the health service unless we fundamentally change it through universal health insurance. We will not reform local government through arbitrary cuts, but by reform which sets out a clear division of responsibilities between local, regional and national level. The objective must be enduring progress, not another round of slash and burn without reform to be followed by a return to the old ways once the immediate crisis has passed. We are living through dark and difficult times. We are being confronted by failures of the past. We are living through a period which is visiting pain on those who deserve no share of it, and we have difficult days ahead. And yet, there is still potential. There is still opportunity to stop speaking of economic recovery in the miserable language which Yeats might have described as adding the halfpence to the pence and prayer to shivering prayer, but to look instead of the type of things not that we need to cut, but the things that we need to keep. To look at what we need to do to ensure that people have decent jobs to go to. That when we think of education, we think, what do we need to do to ensure that every child coming out of a primary school can read after their experience in primary school? Or that when we think of social welfare cuts, that we think in terms not of cutting basic rates, but rather of getting people back to work and reducing the social welfare budget in that way. Or when we think of health, that we think not just in terms of the 1 billion that is recommended to be cut from the health service budget, but that we ask ourselves the question at this time of all times, is our health service fit for the purpose that we need it? As we confront the possibility of a flu epidemic over the next couple of months, is our health service fit for that purpose, fit to meet that challenge? Have we sufficient doctors on the ground in a position to deal with the patient demand that is going to arise? Or are we seriously going to have a pharmacist strike, at the very moment when perhaps we most need their services. I believe that we need to look at the huge challenges that we now have, and they are huge challenges, the huge economic difficulties that we now have, and that we address it not just in terms of how we get the money right. Yes, that's important. How we get the budgets to balance. Yes, that is important. But that we see this moment in time, as Whittaker saw at the late 50s and the political leaders who were around him at the time, but as an opportunity to build a new, fairer, better, and yes, a prosperous Ireland once again. Thanks.